Okay, the game's been out for what, 2 weeks now? I know a lot of people haven't finished yet, but I have and I'm getting antsy, so I think it's time to get back to work. Hello everyone, I am Luxon, and welcome to the first video on this channel after the release of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Like probably a lot of videos that I'm going to be making early on soon after release, this is going to consist of a non-spoiler section and a spoiler section, so the first part of the video, as long as you've seen the 2 trailers and the Xenoblade 3 Direct, will contain absolutely no information about the game that you don't already know, while for those of you who have finished the game and then some, I will also include a spoiler section where I can talk about all of that stuff as well. You might notice that I am not using any of my own Xenoblade 3 footage this time, despite clearly having a capture card and using it for other games in the series. That is because the topic of this video is going to be yet another message sent out to fans of the series by Xenoblade Executive Director Tetsuya Takahashi, but this one was only in Japanese, and as such I have to use a translation. I'm using one provided by Kim Louise Davis to Nintendo Everything, and they were pretty strict with what they wanted people to do when making use of that translation, including sourcing Nintendo Everything and not copying its full contents. So, since I'm going to need to talk about everything mentioned here to make a proper video on it, I figured the best way to go around that would be, while I'm reading through the letter, to literally show the webpage on Nintendo Everything's website. This will also be linked in the description of the video, and while, yes, I am technically showing the entire thing, I am also showing it in the original context of the article, and you can even see the URL in the entire video, so I think I'm okay here. While I will not be discussing Xenoblade 3 spoilers to begin with, I will be discussing 1 and 2 spoilers right off the bat, as this letter just basically makes no secret out of very important events from both games. That out of the way, let's go through this entire article. In an email sent to customers in Japan, Nintendo shared a message from Monolith Soft's Tetsuya Takahashi, the senior director of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. There is a full translation of the note, and it mentions that there are story spoilers about the entire series, as well as the fact that this is more teasing of the future. They've been doing this since 2020 with the release of Future Connected, so it seems like that not only are they really excited about what they did with Xenoblade 3, and they should be, it's a great game, they're also really excited of what they're doing next. I know the last video on my channel was one talking about how they should just end the Xenoblade series with 3 and move on to some other Xeno thing, and I never really expected that to happen. I always figured that they would just say, this is the end of this arc, and we're going to keep the Xenoblade name for marketing purposes, and this is exactly what they're doing. They mentioned in an interview explicitly about 3 that they want to keep the brand going for basically as long as possible. So we don't need to worry about Xenoblade as a series ending anytime soon, especially with the fantastic reviews and seemingly fantastic sales we got through 3. Unfortunately, this article does ignore X, which is slightly unfortunate because I think Elma showing up in Xenoblade 2's DLC is the last time we've heard about X outside of Elma being in the 10th anniversary art. So again, they seem to only be talking about the mainline series, and I guess you could even take this as a hint that the future story arc is going to be X-related entirely and not just mainline Xenoblade. Greetings to everyone who purchased Xenoblade Chronicles 3. This is Takahashi from Monolith Soft. Thanks to your support, we've released the 3rd Xenoblade title, 12 years after the original Xenoblade was released for the Wii in 2010. Keep in mind, Japan exclusive, they're using the Japanese date. Xenoblade 3 has been called the culmination of the whole series up until now, and it truly is the culmination. We at Monolith have put everything we've cultivated over the past 12 years into it. Okay, so yeah, if you like X the most, or like X at all, you're gonna probably be mad at them ignoring X here, and it seems like they're very clearly drawing a distinction between the numbered games and X as being its own separate thing, and that the 1, 2, 3 trilogy, including their expansions, is going to be its own self-contained thing, and while X references it already, and these games also reference X, it's technically going to be this separate thing despite just straight up being another Xenoblade and another Xeno game. Also keep in mind, when they're talking about 3 being the culmination of the series, they are including X. Yes, 3's entire premise is what if 1 and 2 but together, but if you've played 3, or again, even just seen the trailers and the direct, you will know that it's also the culmination gameplay-wise of things that were introduced in X, even if it is structurally more similar to 1 and 2 than it is the fully open world X. So, while they're not mentioning X here and they're straight up saying it doesn't exist, that doesn't mean they don't care about it. They've given it more love than they really needed to, given the small amount it sold in comparison to all of the other games in the series, and they're clearly taking lessons from it with the development of 3 and probably will continue to do so in the future. It is also a stopping point to me. This title depicts the conclusion of the Xenoblade story that began with Klaus's experiment. This is explicit confirmation that this is some sort of end of the story arc. Now keep in mind, this does not necessarily mean that this is the end of the continuity that started with Klaus's experiment. So this isn't necessarily the end of the 2 worlds that were created when Klaus did a boo-boo with the conduit. This just means that the storyline started with the experiment has now ended as of Xenoblade 3 or potentially its DLC. There is technically wiggle room here for Xenoblade 4 to still be another direct sequel to something and carry on other things introduced in 1, 2, and 3 while not necessarily revolving around Klaus whatsoever or having anything to do with the ramifications of what he did. While it is a conclusion, that does not mean it is the end of the Xenoblade series. It is just a stopping point in my mind. I think that everyone who played this title and the additional stories in the expansion pass can imagine what lies in the future for Xenoblade. Now, pause. This is very important, because it explicitly says additional stories will be in the expansion pass, and the same previous interview where they said that they don't want the series to stop anytime soon also mentioned that the story DLC, the last piece of the expansion pass, is going to be about Torna's size and, quote, will not disappoint. So that's kind of a big deal. And then there's the fact that it says additional stories here. However, that does not necessarily mean that the big storyline expansion is going to contain multiple different stories in and of itself. People have theorized that it might be literally Torna 2 and be a prequel to the events that take place in Xenoblade 3, and without spoilers, that's certainly a thing you could do. And if they did that, I could very reasonably see them doing a Keves story and an Agnes story, and have those be multiple stories in the DLC, maybe have them combine at the end and do a Sonic Adventures thing where you have a whole combined story later in the end of the DLC. But I think it's not necessarily saying that. Keep in mind, prior to the story DLC, we're getting 2 waves of challenge battle and at least 2 additional hero characters. And hero characters actually provide a substantial bit of new content. I would wager, beyond just leveling up that hero's class and unlocking different abilities for your character, each hero, just with their unlock quest and their ascension quest to power them and their class up, contains 2 to 3 hours worth of content, which is, I would say, more than the average rare blade in Xenoblade 2, if you just ignore the fact that you have to grind out their affinity chart to even unlock their blade quest. And a good portion of heroes have additional normal quests that, while they're not directly tied to that hero's hero quest storyline, still require that hero, involve them or some of their supporting cast in various cutscenes, and sometimes have requirements or prerequisites that require you to either do some of those quests to unlock that hero's quest, or do those hero's quests to unlock those quests. A hero's storyline does not end once you've done their ascension quest and powered them up, so depending on how hard they want to go with those 2 at least new heroes, we could be seeing 4-ish hours of content at least twice, and then a new Torna-sized DLC, and I think there are enough open slots in 3's world for them to also talk about a few different things that weren't touched on as much in the main story or existing side quests of 3 with those hero quests. So while you can get very excited about the idea that, haha, yes, there are multiple stories in the story expansion, do keep in mind we're going to be getting introduced to at least 2 new characters completely from scratch, so those people will very likely have storylines of their own, and some of them could potentially have to do with the future of the series as well. I don't know if we're going to get full canon transplant and have something as big as characters from the other Xenoblade games or Cosmos and Telos showing up in Xenoblade 2, because while those characters were all non-canon, they were big bits of fan service, and it very much seems like the story DLC is going to be the biggest bit of fan service in the entire expansion pass. So I'm not entirely sure about how big those additional hero storylines are going to be. I don't think they're going to pull throwing Luke in at the end of Street Fighter V's DLC and make the last hero literally a character from Xenoblade 4. That doesn't seem like the thing they do, but I do think that at least thematically or maybe character design-wise or personality-wise, they might include hints at the future while still making whatever these new hero characters are fit in perfectly with the world of Ionios you've already experienced throughout Xenoblade 3. That being said, I do think that as this big capstone on the Klaus saga, the story DLC is going to be one big massive bit of fan service, and that's based purely on the fact that the icon is the 3 swords of all 3 Xenoblade protagonists. Moving on to the last 2 paragraphs, I have one recommendation for how to play Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Some things are marked by a question mark on the game map. Even if you're in the middle of progressing the main story after finding the question marks, try taking a detour. There are many encounters waiting there. Thank you for your continued support of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. So, while yes, this is kind of just PR speak saying, experience more content in the game you've bought and thank you for buying product, it is very important, especially for people who might not have experienced Xenoblade X back in the day, and I'm gonna wager that is the vast majority of people, just based on the ratio of Xenoblade 2 and Definitive Edition sales to Xenoblade X sales. And that just means that, while yes, it is structurally a lot more like Xenoblade 1 and 2, side quests are just as important as they are in X in terms of fleshing out the world, additional characters, and your protagonists. In addition to 3's story being almost entirely related to the protagonists, and focusing on these 6 characters and their relationships with each other and the world, the side stories also expand on them, and even in some of the optional quests, which, by the way, hero quests are completely voiced, far more so than Blade quests were in Xenoblade 2, so the production value is even bigger, you will get large pieces of more information about these characters, to the point where I think a lot of people think some of Senna specifically's best moments come in optional content that has to do with optional heroes. And while that might be a negative, I think it's also a positive, just showing how big and fleshed out all of these characters are, to the point where you can just be doing side content and still be finding more about these people. My main takeaways from this are threefold. 2 of them are just the developers are very proud of, first off, how far the series has come in the past 12 years, and they absolutely should be. Second off, they're also very proud of the side content in Xenoblade 3, and I think they should be maybe to a lesser degree, because I have some opinions of some side content that maybe should have been main content and some main content that maybe should have been side content, but for the most part, this is the best side quests have been in numbered Xenoblade, and the fact that a numbered Xenoblade game with a full plot is rivaling X in terms of side content is genuinely impressive, because the entire tenet of X was there's all this side content and the main plot isn't as big a deal, and then they're managing to rival it with a main plot that can also rival the main plots of 1 and 2. That's great. I have some misgivings about it, but I definitely think they should be proud of not only the quality, but also the quantity of high quality stuff they have, and the general production values present in all of Xenoblade 3. This is a game that is, in its entirety, limited by the Switch and not Monolith Soft's ambitions or imagination, because there is so much stuff. I am impressed with how much they were able to cram into one Switch cartridge, and the fact that it's only 13 gigs is even more impressive, because this is not Nintendo EPD. As far as I can tell, they don't have access to Nintendo's usual first-party compression wizards. This is just pure Monolith magic, and I am consistently in awe at what they're able to produce. The third thing is that they are also very excited to finally move on from the Klaus saga, and I can also understand this. I have a feeling that some part of the Klaus saga post Xenoblade 2 was a Nintendo mandate, and while they were very clearly given a lot more free reign to do whatever they want with Xenoblade 3, this game, or potentially Definitive Edition in Future Connected, might have been just something they had to do, and as such, their plans to move forward were disrupted a little bit by at least one additional release and COVID, so they might be kind of looking forward to doing something outside of the realm of just this one dude's experiment finally. And yeah, it's been 12 years. Admittedly, for a good portion of those 12 years, I don't think they were planning on doing a follow-up to Xenoblade 1 whatsoever, but I think they're really excited to have at least some sort of a clean slate to potentially soft reboot Xenoblade, and not go in with basically any preconceived anything from previous Xenoblade games, or fans like me who are looking at things from previous Xeno games as a whole. This might be the first completely fresh start that Xeno as a whole has been able to have, and we might be finally looking at a Xeno game that is not tied to the original Perfect Works story whatsoever, or at the very least not tied to any elements of it that have already been publicly revealed. I think it's very interesting that Takahashi expects everyone who has played 3 and seen 3's expansion pass stories to know exactly what's happening in the future. And because of how 3 goes, and the fact that there are several different options for where that expansion pass story could lie, and I'm excited about several of those despite having my preferences, seems to indicate that we are in fact missing a piece of the puzzle just by playing through the main story. And that they're going to do something slightly future connected-esque and have some kind of explicit teaser in the expansion pass, which, as long as that doesn't take away from whatever the story and gameplay content in that pass is going to be, I don't necessarily mind them doing that. I'm just worried that they're basically going to make every expansion story to the series an effective Marvel post-credit scene, because while, yeah, I think the big point of 3's expansion pass is just going to be pure fan service for what's come before, and teases for the future, I don't want them to do that every single game. I want this to be just, this is the one thing they do at the end of this story arc, and then expansions are just Torna-like expansions, basically things they wanted to include in the story but didn't get a chance to because of how the writing went during development, and not just fan service-filled romps full of teasers and stuff. If there are more teasers in the future after this expansion pass, I'd rather them be things that I could just take notice of, make theories on, and then be happy when it comes true, or be amazed when they subvert my expectations, rather than them saying outright, yeah, look at this stuff, and you can know what to expect. So yeah, non-spoiler people, I hope I gave you a lot of food for thought there, because I certainly have a lot to think about after this. And I hope this makes you, I guess, even more excited to go through more of Xenoblade 3 than you already have been, or maybe for people who really got screwed over by physical copies to start Xenoblade 3 as a whole, because I think it's very interesting, the fact that they clearly not only had a plan for Xenoblade 3 when they were making Xenoblade 2, but also very clearly had a plan for the next step of Xenoblade while they were making 3, and seem to have factored that into the development of this game and its expansion. So I think we can pretty reasonably say the future is still bright, and while we might not know what it holds, the people who make this series the masterpiece that it is definitely have some ideas and are itching to share that. So the next Xenoblade game better be on improved hardware so they're not constantly hamstrung by the Switch. That's the last thing I gotta say. Okay, we are now moving on into the spoiler section. If you have not finished the main story of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and viewed the ending scene in its entirety through the point where you can make a completed game save and start New Game Plus, do not continue watching this video. I have already given a substantial amount of content just based on non-spoiler things, and you should be playing Xenoblade 3 more instead of spoiling yourself on it. Click away now. I have given you more than enough time to stop watching. If you get spoiled now, it is entirely your fault. Okay, hopefully the people who haven't beaten the game already are gone. And I'm going to actually add a second layer of spoiler warning, because if you've just finished the game and not done New Game Plus or anything else, I would highly, highly recommend that you boot up your cleared game save and unlock the 2 post-game heroes and do the side quests associated with them as well, because they include some additional content that I think is sort of necessary to parse what Takahashi is getting at here. Just go look at your hero album. It's been expanded with 2 additional slots. You can probably guess exactly who those characters are and exactly where to go to unlock them, so go right ahead, do that, and then come back. Okay, that is 2 layers of spoiler prevention. I really hope that the only people still watching are ones who finished the game already, because I warned you a lot, probably too much. I'm definitely losing watch time just from doing this. So, anyway, what are they doing next? Did Xenoblade 3 truly wrap up the Klaus saga? I'm not sure. I am not completely satisfied with the ending of the main story, and while Melia and Nia's hero quest absolutely made massive improvements on that, I don't really know what they're exactly trying to do with these DLC stories, because I could very easily see them going with the very obvious bait that they laid in the city and making the DLC just based purely on the founders, except for the fact that the 2 founders who are based on Shulk and Rex, the statues that are Shulk and Rex are the people's mentors, not the actual people, so we wouldn't get Shulk and Rex there. And the founder of House Vandam, who looks like Noah, does not use Noah's blade because Vandam are mostly pugilists, so that would mean that despite the icon for the expansion pass having the Shulk sword, the Rex sword, and the Noah sword, none of the characters would be Shulk, Rex, or Noah. So will it be an epilogue detailing a grown-up Noah in the original world with time moving properly and meeting Shulk and Rex there? I don't really know, but I think that we can sort of glean what they mean by the future of the series just based on the main story of Xenoblade 3 and additional context from Melia and Nia's quests. Everyone saw the funny photo in the ending of Xenoblade 3 that showed the party of 2 at least a few years after the end of the game, and people are like mainly focusing on all of the children, but I think the big deal with that is Nia saying, "I will see you guys soon," when she very clearly is not going to die when Origin reboots and separates the two worlds again, which indicates that not only is everyone currently alive at the end of Xenoblade 3 going back to their original world, but also that the entire incident creating Ionios took place in the relative near future after the ending of both Xenoblade 1 and 2, and as such, the entire main party of 2 was still alive when that happened, so Origin rebooting and splitting the worlds again is literally going to have Nia go back to the rest of her friends and loved ones from the Xenoblade 2 party. It might seem like everyone died, and while yes, a lot of people, like most of the Napon probably and everyone in the city, did get retconned out of existence by the defeat of Mobius and the rebooting of Origin, literally everyone who was shackled to a flame clock at any point in time is still an alive person from either the Xenoblade 1 world or the Xenoblade 2 world, and everyone we know and love who is confirmed to be alive at the end of Future Connected in Xenoblade 2 is probably perfectly okay and still alive. So it's kind of weird. Xenoblade 3 almost didn't happen. Like, timeline-wise, it all took place in just like that 1 second on the big clock tower in the town outside Alchemoth that we see in the intro and the post-credit scene. So that all happened, but it's very clear that somehow the two worlds are going to be able to find each other and possibly merge correctly again in the future. And there's also very clearly an indication that, at the very least, Noah and Mio still have some sort of recollection of their time in Ionios. And I'm just gonna say, if the combined fears of two universes were able to give birth to a being as powerful as Z, I'm pretty sure that there's gonna be some sort of collective unconscious out there where the memories of everyone from Ionios are stored, and we could very easily have this epilogue be two sets of people, that being a group revolving around an adult Shulk and a Noah who has grown up from the post-credit scene to the age we see him at in the main game, and then another one with an adult Rex and a now grown-up Mio working together to merge the worlds properly, and then the whole setup is, oh, the future takes place in this combined world. So basically, the entire Klaus saga is just, he split the worlds, the two worlds had their own problems that were solved, they collided badly, and then they merged properly, and this new Earth is where stories will take place until the end of the series. They could do that, or they could just play up the multiverse angle. Both the intro cutscene showing the creation of Ionios and Nia's monologue about the nature of Ionios in Chapter 6 very heavily indicate that there are still other worlds out there, and now that Melia and Nia figured out a way to have their worlds communicate, it's also possible we could have a multiversal expansion of Xenoblade as a whole. And if the expansion pass doesn't touch on it, we also have the place where the conduit disappeared to at the end of Xenoblade 2, and the Xenoblade X universe, which is also kind of important. There's also the fact that, from what I can tell, I've not done every single Ascension quest, and I think I have one other gap on my list, but Console A never actually shows up in Xenoblade 3. And at least one Ascension quest does explicitly mention that there are 26 members of Mobius at the time of the game, and this is, I believe, a piece of dialogue that comes directly from records kept by a member of Mobius the party has already defeated. So they would actually know this isn't just conjecture on the part of one of the non-Mobius characters, and this isn't even Mio relaying something from M's memories. This is an independent member of Mobius having some sort of record of all those numbers. So Console A does exist, and that is very clearly something that's either going to be in a free or paid update to the game. It just depends on whether or not that person is going to be in one of the new hero stories, or if they're going to be a big antagonist of the DLC campaign. Because if they're saving A for the DLC campaign, then it's obviously going to be a prequel, because Mobius doesn't exist anymore. But if A shows up before then it's pretty good indication that the big DLC story is going to be some sort of epilogue to the Cloud Saga instead. So there are several options for where things could go. I'm going to say the three biggest are literally the worlds just combine again. Melia and Nia stay in contact as the worlds are still separate, and they eventually figure out a way to do multiverse travel, and we're going to run into different universes, maybe where the experiment went different ways, or ones where the experiment didn't happen whatsoever. And I'm going to say that the universes where the experiment didn't happen whatsoever can be very clear pastiches of Xenogears and Xenosaga, far more than was done in the existing Xenoblade games. Or they could just combine the worlds and have that be how it works. I'm going to say that after Marvel, I'm pretty multiversed out, so I'd be very okay with them either moving on to an independent universe that just makes kind of callbacks to Xenoblade 1 through 3 like X did with 1, or just the far future of Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3 in general, and not really focus on that whole multiverse thing other than, hey, kind of acknowledging that the worlds used to be separate at some point, and that the people with the crystals in their chest came from a different world than the robot people. I'd be okay with that too. I don't really want them to just go full multiverse hopping unless they manage to do a full Xeno crossover, which is never going to happen with Square Enix being the way it is. So there's that. But then there's the other idea, and this is something that I might need to talk about a bit more later in its own independent video, but the big thing about Xenoblade 3 is about securing a future for everyone, even if it might go catastrophically wrong, and even though you have literally no idea what's happening. Now, this is clearly a big theme of the entire Klaus trilogy, because that was one of the big thesis statements of both 1 and 2 as well, but there's a different kind of finality and melancholy to the way it's presented in Xenoblade 3 that kind of indicates that with the end of the Klaus saga, they might want to move on from certain things that have been hallmarks of the Xeno series as a whole. One of the big things, I know it's a Noah quote, and I know it was in a trailer, and I know he says it to N at some point. I don't remember when he says it. It's either in the Chapter 6 fight, in the Origin fight, or when N and M are about to finish off Z for the party. But you can try to move forward again. And I can't help but take this and a lot of the certain lore omissions to sort of be not necessarily a call-out for people like me who like overanalyzing the series and connecting all of old Xeno to Xenoblade, but also just kind of an acknowledgement that they've been mining that well for so long that it might be time to move on from Perfect Works as a whole and do something completely original to the Xenoblade name, while maintaining certain key aspects that make it Xeno, because it's no Xenoblade 1 ditching a lot of things from Gears and Saga, but I think Xenoblade 3 made a conscious effort to distance itself from all previous Xeno games, with the exception of the few pieces that are really, really important, like all of the Gears homaging with the entire story of Noah and Mio, the founder that looks like Faye, the obligatory Cosmos design, and the direct references to Xenoblade 1 and 2. A lot of other cases, I think, they went directly against what you would expect from Xeno, and left a lot more things open-ended than you would expect from the finale to a trilogy, and I think that might partially be by design for a few reasons. I think they wanted to, in a slightly scummy way, leave room for DLC, and I don't entirely begrudge them in the case of wanting to save the big epic fan service stuff for the DLC expansion and not have that clog up the story and overshadow the new characters, because I think if Melia and Nia played a bigger role in the plot of 3 as a whole, as opposed to just kind of being mostly out-of-the-way big good characters who only really get a lot of time to shine in the very ending and the post-game, and if more than just those few returning characters showed up, then they would not have been able to make 3's main cast of 6 as amazing as they are, and I think them having to downplay the fan service and making the 1 and 2 references on par of the 1 references in 2 as opposed to being a big fan service thing, I think that was done to cater to 3's cast and to make them stand alone and show that they can be their own people and their own important main cast and their own heroes that people fall in love with, apart from how they tie back to the old games. So I think that was very smart. And shoving all of the fan service into an optional thing that people who started with 3 might not care about is also probably a good idea. It just depends on how much they want to leave up to interpretation and how much they're literally pulling out and throwing in the DLC in order to make more money off of it. I also think that one of the reasons they left things so open-ended is because they wanted to follow up on certain ideas from 1 and 2, but they didn't want to make people super mad by having it a big crossover of the futures of 1 and 2, and then everyone gives the game bad reviews because their headcanons didn't come true. And, well, I guess they sort of did that with the big photo in Nia's shot at the ending, and I'm sort of 2 minds of that thing. Like, I'm gonna make a full spoiler review at some point, so I'm not gonna talk too much about that. I have some things that I'm confused people are annoyed about that, and I have some things that I am annoyed about that, so that's all thing. But basically, I think they didn't want to go too far into detail with that because they didn't want people getting annoyed about things at the end of 1 and 2 happening different than the narrative that they made in their heads, because no matter how good a writer you are, you're never going to write better than the fanfiction people have had in their heads for the past 5 years. So, like, there was literally no way they could possibly win over everyone while making 3 still an actual sequel to 1 and 2. So I think having Ionios exist for a millennium before the main characters come in and the present story happens, that was a good idea. I don't know if they really needed to completely erase Ionios in the end in order to maintain the status quo and let people's headcanons still happen, and they might not have necessarily done that in a very good way in the first place if people are confused and think Shulk and Rex are actually still dead when they're definitely not. But that's another story. But either way, I think it's interesting that there are several ways things could go. And I think that's okay, because the Xenoblade 3 era is not done yet. And they could very easily sneak in actual lore into Challenge Battle this time. But I think the big thing about this is Takahashi definitely thinks that the events in 3 and 3's expansion pass are still going to remain relevant for the future of the series, even if the Klaus arc is at an end. And to me, that's sort of leaning more in the direction of the worlds are going to combine properly at the end, and the DLC story is going to be an epilogue setting up the actual status quo for this future world that's going to be the setting of Xenoblade 4 in the future. Because I think it would be weird if they would just do a fresh start in a new universe and then claim that the base game of Xenoblade 3 has anything to do with it, when most of the things that it brought up in terms of the greater Xeno multiverse are things that we sort of knew already from Xenoblade 2. Now, it does actually explain several important things and makes several claims that I made outdated. It does disprove some things I had been saying in the past and actually legitimately sheds some light on things I was unsure about. So, well, yeah, you might complain that it didn't touch on, like, Klaus and the Conduit whatsoever. The fact that they're still saying that the main game of 3 has something to do with this before they throw in all the fan service and the DLC heavily indicates that we're not necessarily done with the world yet. I also think that while a lot of Future Connected was very clearly them just needing an additional piece of content to sell Definitive Edition to more people, and a good chunk of it was blatantly setting up the enemies of Xenoblade 3 and the idea that something from outside the world is going to be a threat, there are also a few plot threads like Galgar that maybe can still be followed up on in a future game, and if Future Connected is as much of a lead-in to 3's DLC as it was to 3 itself, I wouldn't really complain about that either. So I think, personally, based on this, that they are saying that even if you were dissatisfied with the way Xenoblade 3 ends, this isn't necessarily the end for the universe that had to do with Klaus's experiment. This is just the end of the ramifications of it. Klaus did his experiment, it destroyed one world and created 2 more. Those worlds had their own rich histories and eventually took charge of their own futures. And then because of those worlds initially being one, they were inexorably drawn back to each other. And that caused a lot of issues. It caused them to come into conflict, but eventually it caused them to cooperate with each other and form bonds stronger than ever thought possible. Bonds of camaraderie, bonds of shared experience, and bonds of love. And through those bonds, they were able to avert the disaster that held both worlds in stasis. And while they would need to pass by each other and separate again, there would always be a lingering memory and a lingering connection of light that they could use to, at the very least, contact each other, and at most, join again properly this time to provide a brand new world, one not defined by or limited by Klaus's experiment, but one defined by the choices of all the people who live in it. And this world is going to be the brave new future that we see in the future of the Xenoblade series. That is my stance just based on what we have now. I'm likely going to make follow-up videos to this point based on every additional new piece of information we get throughout the DLC, but as of now, I think that is where the series is going, and I think I'm looking forward to it. I'm overjoyed that we're not done with Xenoblade 3, because even if the DLC story doesn't revolve around the existing cast, we're still going to see more of them in the Land of Challenge and the hero storylines, so we're not even done with the main 6 Ouroboros heroes yet, and we've got even more story, and more hints of the future, and even more explicit confirmation that the series is far from done. So, I think Xenoblade is still in good hands. I would like to give a major shout out to all of my patrons, whose names you've been seeing on screen for a little bit now, because I haven't gotten to thank them a lot in videos recently, and I haven't made videos in over a month in the final lead up to and me actually getting to play Xenoblade 3, so I would like to thank their patience. So I would like to thank them for their patience and their overwhelming support, because this video is over now, and until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.